Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs, and welcome to the 26th Writers, etc., with Jeet Thayil in conversation with Supriya Nair.
Thank you. Pause.
Very important.
Pause for the ritual.
Yeah.
But all right, to the novel being 2 years old.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you. Since it came out, it seems sort of that the abiding critical question about the novel is how much it drew from life and from your life. And I'm not going to ask you to repeat your answers to that. What I do want to know is how you feel about this biographical mode of criticism, and this biographical mode of reading, where we pick up the book and want to read, you know, the writer's own history into it.
Well, I know the fashionable thing to do in literary criticism today is to forget about the biography and to treat the text as if it exists independently on the page. That's in our historical moment, that's the way we treat text. But when I teach poetry, I do the exact opposite. I talk about the biography of the poet. I try and put the poem in some context. You know, I talk about, and often I pick poems that have a very specific context in the poet's life. And for me, at least, when I know those things, it enriches the poem in a million ways. You know, and it's like hearing a poem read aloud, or even a piece of prose read aloud. I think it reveals itself to you in ways that it wouldn't if you were to merely look at it as shapes on a page.
Right. As something that was kind of sui generis in a way. Yeah, I see that. How long was the book with you?
Well, a long, long time, but I was never able to find the time or the resources to actually work on it. I knew I would, at some point, write about those years, about Shuklaji Street, about the people I knew at that time, and many of whom had disappeared. I just kept putting it off because, you know, I had to earn a living, and I was unable to do it.
I'm sorry, I think it's really interesting that you say you put it off because you had to earn a living. Considering that for most of your literary career you've been a poet, I think it's fair to say that earning a living was probably not at the top of your list of priorities.
No, I think that's true with most poets. In fact, I think that to be a poet, you know, to actually think that writing a poem is a thing of value, and to keep writing poems, and to make that a way of life, I think you have to be perverse in a very deep and profound kind of way. Because what that means is, to do that for your life, to make a life out of that, what it means is you have said no to money, you have said no to any kind of comfort in terms of living, you have said no to returns, to acknowledgement, to appreciation, because your readership is minuscule. You know, there are very few people who are going to read you, and of that number, even fewer will like you. And on top of all of that, it takes about 20 years of work in poetry before you figure out where you're going and what you're about.
Right.
You know, so you have to be insane in a way, and desperately, you know, almost self-defeating to want to do that.
You said earlier that writing it was a memorial act, and that writing about these characters and writing about Shuklaji Street and about this certain time and place was something that you did to retain a memory. At what point when you were, so was this sort of intentional from the very beginning? Or was there a point when you were writing this novel when you realized, you know, this is actually an act of remembrance?
No, in fact, it was absolutely not something I thought about before. It happened quite a way into the writing of it. And I realized that I remembered things that I had no idea I'd retained. Because in those years, I never thought that one day I'm going to write a novel and, you know, this is a kind of embedded journalism or something like that. It wasn't that kind of experience. We were so immersed in it and so kind of overcome by it. Just getting past each day was an achievement all by itself. But later when I came to write about it, 20 years later, I was astonished at how much I remembered. And then faces came to me, and stories of people came to me. And I realized also that with that kind of memory comes a kind of a guilt, a survivor's guilt, and a certain kind of shame that comes with the guilt, and then the worst of the three, a kind of a responsibility. And because I knew that nobody had written about that time, it hadn't been written about, because none of those people, many of them didn't survive, and the ones who did were not writers. So when I came to write about it, it did eventually come to feel like a kind of a memorial stone, you know, with names and dates carved in it.
You were, after sort of decades of working in certain forms, you know, sitting down to write a novel from start to finish. What was the discipline of that like? What did your day become as a working writer?
You know, I'm going to quote Richard Hugo, great American poet, who once said, who had worked many, many jobs, and horrifying jobs, you know, as one does. You know, and I've worked more horrifying jobs than he's worked, you know. He said, and I'm sure he said this as a way of consoling himself. He said, I only ever worked hard on a poem. So I have to say that I only ever really worked hard on poetry and fiction. You know, all the other stuff I really did as little as I could, just to not get fired in a hurry.
What was the other stuff? You already told us about your dark days as an editor and a sub-editor.
Yeah, and a reporter and
Buggish, God. Yeah.
a commentator and a
On what?
the arts usually.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. The highlight was a job in New York for a
When
magazine.
did you live there?
Between 1998 and 2004.
Okay.
I went there to do an MFA in poetry. And I got the MFA in poetry from one of the nicest colleges in the US called Sarah Lawrence College. And with that very expensive degree, I ended up working for possibly the crappiest newspaper in the United States. It should remain nameless, but then again,
No,
why?
come on.
India Abroad. And this was, let me describe this newspaper. Newspaper full of matrimonial ads and lawyers' ads. Right? India Abroad, obviously. And in between the matrimonial ads and the lawyers' ads, there was some white space that needed to be filled.
Right.
And that's where people like me and other fools like me came into the picture.
Right.
So we filled it
Kind of
up.
prop up the classifieds.
Just kind of fill up that very pesky white space. So if a 10-year-old Indian kid won a spelling bee in Oregon, I would be told at 10 a.m., 1,000 words by 5 o'clock tonight on that kid. So then I'd be on the phone talking to the kid, to his parents, to his teachers, to his friends. And my problem was I was always a really bad journalist because, you know, I come from a family of journalists. You give them a story at 10 a.m., my sister, for instance, before the deadline, she will have filed the story.
Right.
Me, the next morning, I will have been there all night, you know, torturing myself about really things that you should really never think about because, you know, nobody's really going to read it very carefully. But I suppose it was a kind of neurosis, and I did that job for 4.5 years.
Let's jump to talking a little bit about poetry.
Sure.
And, you know, the disciplines of poetry. And the start of your career writing poetry, which may have been when you started to read poetry. right?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
In fact, it had everything to do with Baudelaire, which seems appropriate here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For this gathering over
Yeah.
here.
I was 14 and I had an uncle who was, for some reason, absolutely obsessed by Baudelaire, and he lived in Cochin.
With the
In
Fleur du
Kerala.
Mans in particular?
With everything Baudelaire had ever written,
Oh, okay.
including his art criticism. And he had a library of books by Baudelaire in French and in English, and books about Baudelaire, literary criticism about Baudelaire, and portraits of Baudelaire at different stages of his life. He had a bidet in his bathroom in Kerala. Yeah, he was an absolute francophile. But more than that, he was obsessed by Baudelaire. And it was an unhealthy obsession. Unhealthy because we would go to visit Kerala every couple of years, and he always said I was his favorite nephew. I'm sure he said that to all his nephews. But we used to go on walks, and I was 14 when he introduced me to Baudelaire. And really, if you're a good uncle, you would not introduce an impressionable boy of 14 to Baudelaire. So I think I just kind of soaked up his obsession. And I remember picking up this book that he had, translation of Fleur du Mal by two American poets, Edna St. Vincent Millay and George Dillon. And I remember the first poem was a translation of a poem called Lilette. And I read it, and I remember my hair stood on end. I got goosebumps. And I remember many years reading a description by Emily Dickinson about when you know you have read poetry. When the top of your head flies off. What she meant was you have a physical reaction to it. And that's exactly what happened to me. And then I translated Baudelaire into English. I translated 2 poems into English that year, and taught myself French. I studied French for the next, I think, 7 years, to be able to read a little bit of Baudelaire in the French. And I think that's really what did it. And there's some experiences that where an other voice can shock you into your own voice. I think that's what happened with me.
How have you sort of tried to break that down? How does that happen when a voice shocks you into your own? You start writing in response to that.
You do,
Yeah.
and in imitation of.
Is that what happened with you?
Of course, yeah. And I'm glad all those poems have been destroyed. But yeah, certainly the first few poems I wrote were in imitation of Baudelaire. All I can say in my defense is, if you're going to imitate somebody, he's not a bad one.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
It could have been so much less.
It could have been Rod McEwen.
Wait, I don't know who that is.
I'm glad to hear it.
And has Baudelaire stayed with you all these years?
Yes, he has. Yeah, I'm still very happy to pick up random books of criticism. Just picked up something by Roberto Colasso. Fabulous book, kind of a weird view of life through the work and life and poems of Baudelaire.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
What happened to your uncle's Baudelaire library?
When he died, they sent me a big part. He has 4 daughters, and he was actually when he died, he was in the middle of translating Baudelaire into Malayalam.
Oh.
I mean, talk about.
I'm amazed no one has done that before, actually.
Actually,
Right.
but it's impossible for one person to translate Fleur du Mal into any language. You need at least 2 or 3 or 4 people. It's too big a work. So I think he was halfway through it when he died, and they did publish some of that in Malayalam. His eldest daughter published some of that, and she sent me many of the books, including the one I mentioned, the first one that I read.
Oh, I see. How fantastic that you have that legacy still. You've written in response to Baudelaire, and you've written a poem addressed to him.
Yes,
When did you do that? Was in did that come out in your latest collection?
it was in the last one.
It was in the last one, wasn't it?
Yes,
Perhaps we should read it.
sure. In fact, there are copies outside, but I hope I remember it.
Okay.
This is set in Mexico, where I've never been.
Mm.
I think it's, I've read a bit about Mexico. I think it's a good idea to set pieces of writing either in places you've never been to or in places you know really well.
Mm.
But if you visit a place for a couple of days and write about it, not always a great idea.
Right.
You often have the wrong impression.
Impression.
Also, this poem, you know, young poets, when they start to write poetry, they think about the idea of the poet, the romantic idea of the poet, as somebody who burns the candle of life at both ends, who drinks too much, who does way too many drugs, who falls in love with the wrong people, and who basically destroys himself or herself in a very romantic way. You know. And the problem with living that kind of romantic ideal to the end is you get very little work done. You don't do much writing. You do a lot of living and you die young, and you leave a good-looking corpse, but you really don't leave a body of work. You know.
Well, let's not underestimate the good-looking corpse.
You know.
But
So, and I certainly subscribe to that theory of the romantic poet, as did many of my friends, and I certainly hold Baudelaire responsible for many wasted years in my own life. And finally, when I cleaned up my act, I wrote a poem to Baudelaire, a kind of a poem of love and hate. To Baudelaire. I am over you at last in Mexico City, in a white space high above the street, my hands steady, the walls unmoving. It's warm here and safe, and even in winter the rain is benign. Some mornings I let the sounds of the plaza, a fruit seller, a boy acrobat, a woman selling impossible fictions pile up in a corner of the room. I'm not saying I'm happy, but I am healthy and my money is my own. Some mornings when I'm walking in the market past the chickens and the pigs' smoke, I think of you. Your big hair and wolf's heart, your Bonaparte hair and eyes of poem. I don't miss you. I don't miss you when I open a window and light fills the room like water pouring into a paper cup, or when I see a woman's white dress shine like new coins, and I know I could follow my feet to the river and let my life go away from me. At times like this, if I catch myself talking to you, I am always surprised at the words I hear of regret and dumb, boyish devotion. Thank you.
Thank you very much
My
to
pleasure.
Jeet and to
Thank you.
Priya.
thank you.
And that
Thank
was
you,
very
Jean-Pierre.
interesting, very charming, nice moment.